Vanakkam. Welcome to this video on biomechanics. We have been looking at the biomechanics of the joints of the upper limb. Specifically, we looked at shoulder joint and elbow joint. So, we will be looking at the wrist joint and the joints within the fingers. Surprisingly, or rather unsurprisingly, the human hand has a very large number of bones and a lot of bony articulations. These bony articulations, or rather the anatomy, the morphology, the structure gives rise to, perhaps gives rise to the enormous dexterity found in humans. So, it would make sense for us to spend some time to study the hand in some detail. So, let us get started with our analysis of the bones of the hand. So, in this video we will be looking at the bones of the hand, the joints within the hand and the types of joints and the movements that are made by these joints. There are three major types of bones within the hand. The first is the carpal bones. These are the most proximal of the bones within the hand, and there are 8 of these bones, and they are not having any particular shape. They are irregularly shaped bones, proximal bones. So, that is bones that are closest to the wrist joint, these bones called as carpal bones. Each one of them has a name. These are trapezium, trapezoid, scaphoid, bones that are near the thumb. Right. Then more medially in the anatomical reference position, when you are looking at more medially, you have hamate, well actually capitate, hamate. Then more proximally pisiform, triquetrum, lunate. Of course, you have the ulna and the radius, but these form the bones of the forearm. These are the forearm bones. So, here there will be the distal radio-ulnar joint. Remember, while we discussed the elbow, we discussed the proximal radio-ulnar joint. Right. Now, there is one more joint of the radius and ulna, which is called as the again the radio-ulnar joint, but this is more distal. Right. This is the distal radio-ulnar joint. So, the carpal bones are the most proximal of the bones within the hand. Right. So, those that are located closest to the wrist. Right. Then you have the metacarpal bones, those that have articulations with the carpal bones, and there are 5 of these, 5 metacarpal bones. These bones do not have a name, unlike the carpal bones, which are trapezium, trapezoid, scaphoid, hamate, capitate, pisiform, triquetrum and lunate. There are 8 carpal bones. The metacarpal bones are 5 in number and they do not have a name. They are simply called as the first metacarpal, second metacarpal, third metacarpal, fourth metacarpal and fifth metacarpal. The metacarpal bone of the thumb is called as the first metacarpal, that for the index finger is called as the second, third, fourth and fifth, so on. Right. So, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is assigned from the thumb to the little finger. Okay. So, if someone says the fourth metacarpal, they are referring to the metacarpal bone of the ring finger, okay. Something to keep in mind. Then you have the bones within the fingers themselves, those that form the segments of the fingers. Each segment is called as a phalanx. The plural is phalanges. Each finger except the thumb has 3 such segments or phalanges. So, let us take the index finger. You have this segment and then this segment and then the distal most segment. So, the segment that is closest to the palm or the most proximal of this segment is called as the proximal phalanx, and the one in the middle is called as the intermediate phalanx, and the most distal of these is called as the distal phalanx. Okay. The thumb has only two phalanges, one is called as the proximal phalanx, the other one is called as the distal phalanx. There is no intermediate phalanx in the thumb. Okay. So, if I were to count, I will have essentially how many phalanges? I will have 3 times 4, there are 4 fingers and 3 segments in each of them. So, I will have 12 total phalanges for the 4 fingers, and I have 2 more phalanges for the thumb. So, I have a set of 14 phalanges, right. So, that is that, but that is not counting the special nature of the thumb, which we will discuss in the future slides, because the nature of the carpo-metacarpal joint for the digits 2, 3, 4, 5. When I say digit 2, 3, 4, 5, I am talking about index, middle, ring, little. The first digit is the thumb. So, the nature of the carpo-metacarpal joint for the digits 2, 3, 4, 5 or the index, middle, ring and little finger is very different from the nature of the carpo-metacarpal joint for the thumb. So, we will have to discuss these details. In this kind of work, in this kind of field, the delight is always in the details. So, let us take the carpo-metacarpal joint. This is where the articulation of the carpal bones and the metacarpal bones happen, right. So, this joint is called as a CMC joint. CMC means carpo-metacarpal joint, right. Carpo-metacarpal joint, CMC joint. The articulation is happening between the carpal bones and the metacarpal bones. So, for the thumb let us remember, this is what we are discussing, right. This is the carpo-metacarpal joint for the thumb. It turns out that for the fingers there is very little to no movement that happens at the CMC joint of the 4 digits or digits 2, 3, 4 and 5. However, it turns out for the thumb a lot of articulation, a lot of movement originates at the CMC joint, a unique feature of the thumb, something that we will have to discuss in future. So, the nature of this joint is a saddle joint and ellipsoidal joint, right. What about the metacarpophalangeal joint? MCP means the joint or the articulation between the metacarpal bones and the finger segments, right. This is the metacarpophalangeal joints or the MCP joints. Metacarpal, MC, here there is a P, but it is rather metacarpophalangeal joint, metacarpophalangeal joint, MCP joints. This is where the metacarpal bones meet the finger phalanges or the finger segments. These are ellipsoidal joints. Then you have the joints between the finger segments itself or the articulation between the phalanges themselves, right. These are the so called interphalangeal joints or the IP joints, interphalangeal joints. For the thumb there are only 2 phalanges and there is exactly one interphalangeal joint, IP joint is 1 in number for the thumb. For the other fingers there are 2 interphalangeal joint, one here and one there, that is the proximal interphalangeal joint and the distal interphalangeal joint, pip joint and the dip joint. The joint that is closest to the palm or the more proximal of these joints is called as the PIP joint or the proximal interphalangeal joint. The one that is more distal is called as the DIP joint or the distal interphalangeal joint. Okay. Both of these are hinge joints, meaning that they are going to have 1 degree of freedom. Okay. Now, let us look at the movements of the joints of the hand. Okay. We start with the carpo-metacarpal joint or the CMC joint of the thumb, that is that joint. Remember, that is not on this joint. This is the metacarpophalangeal joint. I am talking about that joint, right, the joint that is closest to the wrist. It turns out that only for the thumb in humans, in particular in humans, only for the thumb, the CMC joint is a unique, very well articulated and highly movable joint, right. It is a saddle joint, and many of the movements made by the thumb, because of the nature of this saddle joint and the amount of movements that are possible within this saddle joint, the movements that are made by the thumb are many times out of the plane of the palm, and it turns out that the movements are the plane perpendicular to which this movement is happening keeps on changing because of the nature of the saddle joint and the amount of articulation that is present in this joint. It is an extremely difficult geometry to describe. So, this is the nature of this saddle joint, which is highly movable, highly articulated movement within the thumb, right. So, one movement that we find is the flexion and extension of the thumb, that is flexion, extension, right, as shown. Then I have, remember, we always consider the anatomical position when we discuss. When the thumb moves away from the midline of the body like that, as I am showing now, away from the midline, it is called abduction. It is like kidnapping or abduct, to move away from the midline, abduction. When you move toward the midline, it is called adduction. Then you have this movement that you are seeing now, which is a combination of the flexion, extension and abduction and adduction. That actually my thumb movements are somewhat restricted because of a fracture that I had in my scaphoid bone, but you can try it on yourself, you will find that that is that. Then because of the special nature of the thumb and a special muscle available to perform apposition, in particular in humans, this is a very well developed feature. It turns out that the thumb can perform apposition to the individual fingers, like I am now showing. This is called apposition movements, right. So, that is that movement. This is also a combination of flexion, extension and abduction, adduction, right, depending on in which direction you are moving, toward the digit or you are moving away from the digit. It is a combination of the two this. Perhaps all of this come from the nature of the saddle joint of the CMC or the carpometacarpal joint, such a very well movable joint. For the other fingers, what happens at the CMC joint, right? Technically, these are not very well movable joints, so you can do that. This is the movement that happens at the CMC joint, as a whole, but individually it is very difficult to move individual fingers like that. A reason is because there is this lack of finger individuation, something that we will discuss in future. So, that flexion, extension is possible. This is again an ellipsoidal joint, this CMC joint. Then you have the metacarpophalangeal joint, in which there is a lot more of this articulation present, a lot more of this movement that can be visibly seen, right. That is that movement versus that movement, flexion and extension. And also I can do that. See, when I am keeping like this, when I am moving the index finger away from the midline like that, when I am doing that, it is abducted away. I can also do that, right, I can do that, abduction of the fingers and adduction of the fingers. This is possible because of some special muscles that are responsible for abducting this, for performing that movement, right. That happens at the metacarpophalangeal joint, which is a 2 degree of freedom. So, I can do that, I can do that, that is I can do this sort of movement. I can also do that sort of movement, sideways movement, which is abduction, adduction and flexion, extension. I can do that. So, it is a 2 degree of freedom joint. Of course, I can do this, right, the circumduction, which can be classified as a combination of flexion, extension and abduction, adduction. I can do this. Remember, you can only do this at the MCP joint, at the metacarpophalangeal joint. You cannot, for example, do it at the interphalangeal joint. That is not possible because the interphalangeal joints are hinge joints with 1 degree of freedom. Remember that. You cannot rotate like this and just try to do that. You will realize that it is impossible. Then you have the proximal interphalangeal joint. This is where the proximal phalanx and the intermediate phalanx or the middle phalanx meet. This is a hinge joint in which there is flexion. You can extend up to a limit, but extending beyond that limit, anatomical range, is not possible. So, or rather what one would call as hyperextension is not possible, at least not in the PIP joint, proximal interphalangeal joint. So, a lot of flexion is possible, but a limited amount of extension is possible. Okay. So, flexion, extension, like this I can do that. Then you have the distal interphalangeal joint. These are these joints, right. In these joints, again this is a hinge joint. I can perform, it is quite difficult to demonstrate this flexion, but you can observe I can perform minimal flexion like that and extension, flexion, extension like that. One thing that is possible in the dip joint, but not in the PIP joint, is this sort of hyperextension. I can actually push with an external force with the left finger. I am pushing on the right finger like that. This is possible. This is some hyperextension that is happening at the dip joint, but that is not possible at the PIP joint. So, something to keep in mind. So, extension or voluntary extension is rather limited in both the interphalangeal joint. Hyperextension through an external load is possible at the dip joint, but not in the PIP joint. Okay. So, with this we come to the end of this video. In this video we have seen the set of all bones of the hand. What are these bones? The carpal bones that are 8 in number, that are closest to the wrist here, and the metacarpal bones that are 5 in number, that attach or that articulate with the carpal bones. Each one of these metacarpal bones is called the first metacarpal, second metacarpal, third metacarpal, fourth metacarpal and fifth metacarpal. But the carpal bones have names, right? Trapezium, trapezoid, scaphoid, etc. Right. Then you have after the metacarpal bones you have the finger segments themselves. These are called as the phalanges. Segments are, singular is phalanx, plural is phalanges, right. The phalanges, these are 3 in number for the 4 digits 2, 3, 4, 5 and 2 in number for the thumb, and the corresponding metacarpophalangeal joints. Earlier when we discussed carpal metacarpal joint, then metacarpal phalangeal joint, and then the interphalangeal joint. There are 2 such joints for digits 2, 3, 4, 5 and only 1 such joint for the thumb. So, these are the various bones that are present in the hand. How many? Let us try to do this math one more time. Carpals 8, metacarpals 5, then phalanges 3 per finger for the 4 fingers 12, Then thumb phalanges 2, 14 plus 13. The math correct? There are 27 bones in each hand, and many of these bones are highly movable and possible to articulate extraordinarily well. Some of them are not very movable, yes, but some of them are highly movable, which is why you have this dexterous, highly dexterous machine, that is the wonder, that is the human hand. So, we saw the bones of the hand, the joints of the hand and the types of these joints and the movements that happen within these joints of the hand. So, with this we come to the end of this video. Thank you very much for your attention.